Hi, I want to share a few tips for propping Virasana. Virasana is hero's pose, and it's a big pose. It involves a big movement in the ankle, deep flexion in the knee, and also the femur is up in the hip socket, so 3 joints are involved pretty significantly, which gives it plenty of opportunity to be a problem for just about everybody. So props to the rescue. Virasana, we've got knees about hip distance apart, even close together for some folks. And you want your hips right between your heels, sitting as firmly against the floor as we can. We're looking for feet to point straight back. So you can see here, this big ankle mobility is required, the capacity to bend the knee significantly into deep flexion, and even here, the femurs need a way to be placed into the hip socket to sit comfortably. So one thing that we may find when we're looking at Virasana, if you're a teacher, you'll see this in a lot of your students, is when the ankle joint is tight. You'll see a student who wants very sincerely to sit in Virasana, but they can't get any of this distance to be closed. Their feet are limited in their range of motion in the ankle joint. So one thing that we can do for a student who finds themselves in that position is to give support to that place. And you take a blanket roll, depending on, sometimes it's a significant bend, sometimes it's not so much. What we're looking to do is give some support with whatever degree of blanket roll you need, like so. So that then, instead of just being free in space, there can be support and a sense of descent. And so by supporting the ankles, many students, if their knees are fine, can sit even on that blanket roll, like so. So, however, sometimes it's not really quite that simple, because if the ankles need their support, many times the knee joints have some sense of limitation as well, and they can't come into full flexion. And so you need to build this part underneath your hips, not part of the pose up. And by elevating the hips, you'll create less pressure going into the knee joint. So blankets are a really great way to work with that. Take a blanket. One thing to know for yourself, if you're propping your Virasana, or if you're helping a student find the appropriate placement for themselves, is it's going to take some time. And be very relaxed as much as you can about it for yourself and also for your students. So that you don't have to get it right all the way. You want to say, is this better? Is this worse? Is it no different? And that gives a student an opportunity, or gives yourself an opportunity to evaluate, is this helping? Is it making it worse? Or is it not making a difference at all? Sometimes when we're really working hard to help our students sometimes feel obligated to tell us it's helping when it really isn't helping. So we want to help them tell us the truth so that the prop actually becomes a beneficial situation. It's a little tip there. Okay, so let's say I still needed this blanket roll underneath my feet, and I needed less pressure in my knees. I take this blanket on top, like so, to elevate my hips, or help my students elevate their hips. The other thing is we want to be really relaxed about whether this works. This might not be enough height. And if this wasn't enough height, I would just go to the prop shelf and I would get another blanket to help my students' hips come up even higher. So again, we want to start to empower our students to get the props that they need. And then when you get them, or yourself, and when you get it set up, really memorize it, and so you know what you need for the pose. So that's one scenario that may work. Another way, let's say your student's feet, that's really not the problem, and the ankles. Here, you're going to take a block between your 2 feet and sit on the block. Sometimes you need even more height than that. You're going to take a blanket, so now I have it folded several times, and take a blanket to bring the hips up even higher. So you can see already, just by elevating the hips, there's a less bend in the knee. Eventually, you could elevate your hips so high that there's a lot of pressure going down into your knee, and that becomes a much more complicated scenario, a little bit outside the scope of a 5-minute little tip. Okay, so block and blanket, or the blanket roll, and the blanket folded underneath you. Those are great to experiment with. Now, one of my favorite ways to prop this pose is what I call the blanket sling. And I find that this is a really accessible pose for many folks, even because it gives just a little bit of height and a great deal of support. For this one, I've got my blanket. You want to say you've got an uneven edge and then this folded edge. And I'll show you this. You take your legs. So underneath the blanket, they're doing Virasana, pointing straight back. But I take this folded edge of the blanket right up behind my knees. And that folded edge comes in here and puts just a little space in between the back of the knee joint. And when you sit down, I'm not sitting on my heels, but I'm sitting in the blanket as though it's a little bit of a sling for my buttocks. What's fantastic about this is that little space in the knee joint can bring relief. The other thing that's fantastic about it is just the small amount of height underneath the hips translates for most people into knee joints and kneecaps that are facing straight ahead, so it's a fairly conservative position for your knee. Sometimes even folks who can sit flat with no pain initially will start to run into trouble with that deep internal rotation of the femurs, and sometimes it creates a torsion in the knee joint. So if I'm teaching, a lot of times I'll have everybody get a blanket, everybody do it this way. That way, the people who need the prop, they'll feel singled out, and the folks that don't need the prop, no harm's gonna come by doing a nice conservative form of the pose. Keep in mind, because this one doesn't prop the ankles, you could add that piece in as well underneath the blanket roll, depending on what you or what your students need. So it's a great pose, does a lot for us in these ankle joint, knee joint, hip joint scenarios, but it gives a lot of problem-solving opportunities for most of us along the way. So good luck and have a great time.